It's difficult to run a company. It's nearly impossible to run a car company. But there was one that did so well, so impossibly magnificently well, until one day it didn't. That company was Cadillac, a company that was once considered a game changer in the international automobile industry during the 20th century, and now it's just there, barely able to keep up with its competitors. So the question is, what happened? Why did it fail? But also, why did it do so well in the first place? This is the story of Cadillac. By the year 1896, cars were slowly becoming all the rage. Even though most of the innovation was done in Europe, there was something simmering in the very young automobile industry in America. And that's when the first ever motorized car in the US won a public race held by Chicago newspaper in 1894, that everyone really started to see that cars were the future. But while all this was happening, one man was still sitting in his small workshop tinkering with his bicycle, even in 1896, and this man was Henry Leland. Little did he know that by the close of the century, he would be known as one of the finest car makers of the 20th century. But you'd be surprised to know that while this man was the one who made Cadillac the manufacturing marvel that it was, he wasn't really the one who created it. Cadillac was created from the remnants of the Henry Ford Company. It just so happened that Ford walked away along with his investors from the company. Ford's financial backers then scrambled to find a new manager, and there was one candidate that every single person agreed on, and it happened to be senior engineer Henry Leland. Of course, even before Cadillac, Henry Leland had established quite a reputation for himself. From a very young age, Henry had been working as an apprentice on a farm, then in a good factory, and later as a mechanic at the Crompton Works in England. Throughout his early life and career, Henry had to face certain prejudice and coldness from his peers at the Crompton Works workshop, since he was the only American working there. You see, at that time, Europeans looked down on Americans as uncivilized and unskilled. But still, Henry was unfazed, and over the years, it was widely accepted that he was a prolific engineer. On December 19, 1899, he started a manufacturing company, the Leland Falconer and North. By 1901, Leland and Falconer was already a well-established manufacturing firm in the US. So when Henry was called by Ford's management, he decided to take over the company. On the 27th of August 1902, the Cadillac Automobile Company was brought under the control of Henry Leland. Cadillac was named after the French adventurer Anton de la Mothe Cadillac. And hear why this is a genius name. Not only did it sound luxurious and fancy to Americans at the time, but it also related to French royalty. In a way, it showed that Cadillac always had ambitions to be a symbol of prestige, and secondly, to be ready to go shoulder to shoulder with the mighty European car companies. As the director, Henry was given a small block of the company's stock. The first Cadillac was made on October 29, 1902. It was displayed at the automobile show by William Metzger, the sales manager, and became an instant hit in the American market. Metzger took orders and deposits for 1,000 cars at this show alone. Model A was sold for $750 and Model B was sold for $900. These new Cadillacs had a steering wheel instead of a tiller, which was very unusual for the time. And after this, it was clear, Cadillac has set out to establish its name as a pioneer in automobiles. And that's what it did. Inspired by Cadillac's success, steering wheels were adopted by rival companies and soon became the industry standard. This was pretty remarkable since around that time, in 1903, 57 car companies entered the automobile industry. Of course, only 27 managed to survive. With this kind of ruthless state of the automobile industry, Cadillac, from the beginning, became a formidable rival to its competitors. Surprisingly, Cadillac was also the first company to realize that there had to be a better way of making cars than by hand. In this way, Cadillac revolutionized the way car manufacturing was done. According to European car companies, the finest of cars could only be handmade, and Cadillac would prove this perception wrong by using machines in its manufacturing process and making its production so efficient that other companies really had no choice but to follow along. But there were problems, especially with Leland and Falconer, L&F, which was the main supplier of the engines for the Cadillac. One member of the Cadillac board of directors said that they should use engines other than L&F since they were far too costly than other engines. You need to remember that L&F was, at this time, owned by Henry, so naturally Henry refused to even consider this. He said that if Cadillac entered into a contract with any other engine supplier, he would walk out. And surprisingly, he almost did. He told the company's director that L&F had received a better contract with the Studebakers and he was about to leave. Instead, the directors begged him to stay. On December 24, 1904, the management of Cadillacs was brought under the L&F and therefore Henry. And Henry, along with his two other directors, began spending more and more time on Cadillac and less on L&F. It was also a time when Cadillac set its eyes on massive expansion. It rapidly increased its production capacity during the first year, and it all paid off when in the second year, around 50 cars could be built every day. The production went into an all-time high. From May 1904 to May 1905, around 3,868 Cadillacs were shipped out. But this production wasn't just following the rules, making the same old. No, Cadillac always wanted to offer something new to its customers with each release. This became one of the reasons for Cadillac's initial success. It was so bent on improving its technology all the time that this meant that for some time, Cadillac had no competition. Rival companies could not believe how quickly Cadillac was able to make leaps in technological improvements. The further it got ahead of the race, the more customers were at its doors. Most of the reason for that was, of course, Henry's prowess in mechanics and his lifelong experience of spending days and nights in workshops. Cadillac began gaining media attention, so much so that a 1903 advertisement in Cycle and Automobile Trade Journal reached Frederick Bennett, who worked for the Anglo-American Morrill Co. in London, England. Bennett liked the shape of the Cadillac and decided to convince the company to put it up. This led to Cadillac's first ever sales office in London, and the break-in of American cars in European markets. In 1907, Bennett visited Detroit to see the Cadillac factory and was very impressed with how Henry ran things. Establishing an office in London allowed Cadillac to access a wider customer base that would be more impressed with his innovative engineering. In 1909, Cadillac was presented a Dewar Trophy, and this became the first time an American company was honored with the award. But the truth is, no one was doing it like Cadillac. In 1908, 3 Cadillac cars were disassembled and then reassembled by the Royal Automobile Club, and the assemblers realized that they only need screwdrivers and spanners to do it. Long were the days of needlessly filling the cars with sandpaper. They also realized that a lot of the parts were interchangeable. This made the introduction of Cadillacs easy, reliable, and of course, extremely efficient. But while Henry was deeply satisfied and proud of the mechanics of his 1903 Cadillac, he saw the world of automobiles shift at a very rapid pace, and then realized in 1907, one-cylinder cars simply would not do. And one-cylinder cars were all that Cadillac was offering at that time. So in the fall of 1908, the Cadillac 30 was introduced, which was a multi-cylinder car with tremendous strength. This was unventured territory for Henry. He was a man who stuck to ideals and refused to follow trends. If he felt like he was doing the right thing, it didn't matter to him how far the rest of the industry was. And it was all done to maintain quality standards. Unlike other car companies, Cadillac refused to be a cash grab, instead taking its time to offer actual value to its customers. But this was the first time Henry followed the trends, and it paid off tremendously. Within 6 weeks, the Cadillac 30 sold 4,500 units. There was another curious thing about Cadillac. While other car companies constantly sought ways to cut down production costs, Henry believed that if some manufacturing part was offered at a cheap price, it was too good to be true. He was so deeply concerned with maintaining high quality standards that once he received a contract that offered him a certain part of the car at very low prices, although it was a tempting deal for people around him, Henry flat out rejected this offer. So for decades to come, Cadillac would continue to bear high production costs for the sake of quality. So much so that by 1921, the Cadillac became the most expensive car produced by General Motors at $5,190. The success of the Cadillac 30 caught the attention of General Motors, which decided to buy the Cadillac. After several back and forths about the price, General Motors agreed to purchase the Cadillac for $4.5 million. But the owner of General Motors, William Durant, didn't just want the company, he wanted the brains behind it as well. When Henry and his son Wilford, who was also working at Cadillac, were about to close the deal, they stated that they wanted to run Cadillac the same way it always was, to which Durant replied, this is exactly what he wanted them to do. For the next decade, Cadillac's top leadership will run seamlessly. Durant didn't want to interfere with the day-to-day matters of the company, and the Lelands simply didn't want any interference from General Motors on how to run the company. The ownership of the company became divorced from his control. Though this arrangement worked out well for all parties at the time, time would later show that things would soon change. And the first cracks began to show when General Motors' poor financial state began to affect the companies under it, which of course included Cadillac. The problem was, bankers and creditors simply did not trust that the automobile industry was stable enough to be given a loan, and all the General Motors had under it were automobile companies. Naturally, when finances shriveled up and General Motors realized it needed money just to go through its day-to-day operations, the situation had grown pretty dire. General Motors was very close to going bankrupt, or at least a complete financial disaster, and Cadillac's existence was threatened by it. There was something apparent to some people, but Durant wasn't one of them. He continued to spend extensively without taking into account the fact that banks might not want to give him a loan. Henry saw this problem coming. He realized Durant's spending was simply not sustainable. By September of 1910, General Motors seemed to be on the verge of bankruptcy. So Durant desperately arranged meetings with bankers to get loans, and on those meetings, he took Wilfred, Henry's son. Turns out, the bankers weren't impressed with General Motors' state, but they were very impressed with how Wilfred and Henry had been running Cadillac. So they held another meeting with just Wilfred alone, who was able to convince bankers that automobile companies are worth investing in. Much to Durant's surprise, who had been kept out of the loop with Wilfred's meetings, General Motors received a loan of $15 million. It was on that day that Leland saved General Motors from disaster. Durant was forced to step down from active manager, and in his stead, 5 trustees were appointed to ensure that the management of General Motors was handled better. But while the loan from the bankers was received by General Motors, unlike Durant, these 5 trustees refused to acknowledge the fact that it was Cadillac's strength that had pulled General Motors from the brink of bankruptcy. These 5 trustees met the Lelands shortly after receiving the loan and told them they would cut the compensation that Cadillac was to receive by half. And this is where the ownership control issue began showing its face. The Lelands were forced to accept this unfair change, and they still needed to increase Cadillac production and revenue exponentially since this was the only reason the loan had been given out in the first place. The creditors had confidence in Cadillac's potential, and after Wilfred had spent hours convincing creditors that the automobile industry was stable enough to provide loans to, Cadillac had to prove it with numbers. So, as you can imagine, the Cadillac management also knew that the primary reason for this predicament they saw themselves in was the poor management at General Motors. And despite being General Motors' biggest moneymaker, Cadillac still didn't have any managerial power in General Motors, its overhead company. Soon, this would change once Thomas Neal, the secretary and general manager of ACME hit Lead and Color Works of Detroit, was appointed as the president of General Motors. But the problem was Neal and his new team had no experience in the automobile industry, and were very confused regarding its high technicalities. Slowly, the management of Cadillac was integrated into the management of General Motors. It was during this time that Henry and his son Wilfred worked around the clock. Wilfred would reach his breaking point almost twice in this period. Strangely enough, Henry, despite nearing his 70s, was the more durable of the two, often staying up very late at night at the factory because he simply couldn't sleep at night. This relentless dedication and expansion of Cadillac proved fruitful as by 1915, the company had earned $58 million. In November of 1911, Durant regained control of General Motors and he reversed some of the decisions made by Neal, and was appalled that the compensation to Cadillac and the Lelands had been cut in half. He immediately set to rectify that. Durant and the Lelands were once again on working terms. But while the leadership changes in Motors weren't something Cadillac could control, what it could and did control was its skilled labor and expert engineers. This was something other car companies had struggled to find. American engineers still had quite a lot of catching up to do with European car makers, but Cadillac had a pretty steady supply of engineers who understood the culture of the company and its need to bring radical changes to the automobile industry. And it was all because of Henry's love for imparting knowledge. Henry was always willing to share what he had learned in his career in mechanics with other people. So in May of 1907, he opened up the Cadillac School of Applied Mechanics for students to study the art of the automobile industry. Not only did this put Cadillac miles ahead of its competition in terms of R&D, but it also meant that aspiring engineers had a place to hone their skills and master their craft. Naturally, the combined effort spurred and Cadillac came up with another innovation, and this one had to do with starting the engine. During that time, cars required large physical strength to pull the lever several times before the engine came to life. In a way, starting the car was a workout in of itself. And as it turns out, there was a road accident where the driver could not start the car properly, and it just so happened that two Cadillac engineers were in the same place and witnessed the whole thing go down. And then they had an idea. They went back and reported this to Henry, who realized that there needed to be a better mechanism to start the motor of cars. After several trials and errors, the engineers at Cadillac decided that only one way to correct this was an electrical device. As the production started, rumors began to fly around the industry that Cadillac was about to completely revolutionize automobiles. So on August 20th, 1911, an official announcement was made that the 1912 model of the Cadillac would be equipped with an electrical starter. The industry was shocked, and understandably so. Cadillac cars would from then on be started with just one push of a button. Other companies scrambled to introduce their version of easy motor starters, from the compressed air self-starters to acetylene starters. Not just that, they attempted to jeopardize Cadillac's success, and rumors began to fly out that the new cars were just a half-baked investment that would fail miserably. But despite all that, Cadillac won the game in the end. In 1912, the new Cadillacs were unveiled, and around 13,994 cars were supplied. The electrical self-starter was quickly adopted by other companies such as Chalmers, Peerless, and Regal in their 1913 cars. Cadillac had now established yet again another industry standard. This even got the Royal Automobile Club interested, and they ran tests on the new Cadillac in 1913, and were so impressed they awarded it the Dewar Award for the second time. Henry then laid his sights on an even greater invention. After 1913, Cadillac received a very lukewarm response. He decided that they needed to push boundaries, so he began working on an 8-cylinder motor. He also decided to keep this production under wraps until it was proven to be a successful test. So to keep things secret, individual parts were manufactured not at a Cadillac factory, but in an old abandoned warehouse where they were then assembled under a false company name, Ideal Manufacturing Company. To an outsider, it seems as if this would have nothing to do with Cadillac, and that's what Henry wanted. The cost of producing a V8 was around $15,000 each, which did not include the cost of overheads. The bankers were concerned about this extravagant and deeply risky project, but still they continued working on the new model. In 1914, the new Cadillac was rolled out and became the first 8-cylinder engine car in America. While the media was deeply positive about this new model, rival companies tried to dismiss this new technology, claiming that more cylinders just translated to more trouble. But Cadillac remained firm in its decision. In fact, every Cadillac made from 1914 to 1927 would go on to use the same 8-cylinder technology. But the Cadillac was about to have a major shift again. And this time, it would not be the cars, but the leadership would change. In 1914, the First World War broke out in Europe, and coincidentally, it was also the time when Henry broke his hip and had to take a trip to Florida. On his flight, he thought about how weak the airplane's engine was, and how he should make an airplane engine that would be far superior to the one he saw. Another coincidence occurred when Benjamin, who managed the Cadillac established in London, was also thinking along similar lines at the same time. So he got in touch with Henry and discussed whether it was possible to make airplane engines. This grew especially important since Henry had a hunch that America might need to involve itself in the war soon, and for that, it needed to be equipped with the best planes possible. Initially, the Lelands did want to stick with Cadillac and start manufacturing airplanes under its umbrella. On April 17, 1917, Wilfred sent a message to Durant to see if they could use the new Cadillac building not for the production of cars, but rather airplanes. Durant found the whole idea ridiculous and flat out refused to let them do it. Henry and Wilfred realized that they could only make airplanes if they were independent of General Motors and Durant's rule, so they handed in their resignations from Cadillac and parted ways. They established their independent manufacturing company, Lincoln Motors & Co., and soon enough, Durant rushed to them and begged them to return, but by that time, it was already too late. Henry's decision was absolute. They wanted to devote their energies to a completely independent airplane motor company. With the Lelands, it was apparent that the next few models would either make or break the company. It could no longer rely on the Leland's engineering expertise to sell cars. So for the first time since its launch, Cadillac began to focus on design. All previous models of the Cadillac had been designed by the engineers themselves, focusing more on practicality rather than beauty. But this would all change once Cadillac began bringing in designers to do the job. And this strategy worked. In 1926, Cadillac offered customers more than 900 color combinations to choose from. Then came another change in design. In 1927, designer Harley Earl was brought in to design the new model of the Cadillac. And then came the Great Depression of the 1930s. If you're wondering how automobile companies survive when the entire country is plunged deep into a recession, the answer is they don't. Or, well, they barely do. While America was in the throes of the Great Depression in the 1930s, like other automobile companies, Cadillac too was suffering. General Motors was still barely profitable, but it only came at the expense of extreme cost cutting. This meant that it had to make painful decisions about which divisions get to survive, and which simply to let go of. For some, like Cadillac, there were intense discussions about whether to simply pull the plug or to watch it out and see how the company fares. And as the executive committee of directors at General Motors sat down to discuss Cadillac's fate, one person would become its savior. And that one person would be Nicholas Dradestad. He claimed that he knew a way to make Cadillac profitable even when America was going into the Great Depression. Cadillacs, at the time, were still considered a symbol of prestige. Only a very small elite class of Americans were approved by the company to make a purchase. One community that Cadillac had irrationally barred from making purchases was the African American community. This meant that in its ambition to remain exclusive, Cadillac was denying its cars to all African American elites. Nicholas argued that this was ridiculous. Cadillac was missing out on a huge chunk of revenue in this way, so he immediately rectified that. Once this rule was removed, Cadillac sales went up by 70%, and it managed to reach a break-even point. In 1934, encouraged by the success, Nicholas was made the head of Cadillac. The second thing that Nicholas did was drastically reduce production costs without compromising on the quality of cars. If one part was costing the other companies $2 per unit and was sold to Cadillac for $4 per unit, Nicholas would question why this was in stark contrast to Henry, who believed that good quality production parts always came at a high cost. But when there was an intense focus on reducing production costs, the price remained the same. Soon Cadillac became General Motors' most profitable car per unit. And strangely enough, Cadillac sold more cars in 1937, when America was still facing the Great Depression, than it did in the year of 1928 during the Roaring Twenties. This was mainly due to the models it unveiled during the 30s. Cadillac introduced the V16 model with 16 cylinders. Later, it would introduce a 12-cylinder model for those who wanted something better than the V8 but couldn't yet afford the V16. And then came the 1940s. In the first half of this decade, Europe was ravaged by the Second War. Cadillac for the first time was less concerned about manufacturing cars and instead began manufacturing airplanes to help with the war. But that's not all. Cadillac slowly began transitioning into manufacturing light tanks. But that didn't mean it completely ignored the cars that had brought so much success. In 1941, designed by Bill Mitchell, the Cadillac 60 Special was deemed the most beautiful design the brand had ever made. And after the war, using the newfound knowledge of aircraft manufacturing, Cadillac went back to automobile production and created Tailfin, which would be the first time it was made on a vehicle and would soon become the mark of a luxury Cadillac car. And in 1949, Cadillac will win the Car of the Year award. The 40s were a glorious decade for Cadillac, and was seen in the year 1950 when Cadillac sold 100,000 units in a single year. This was the largest it had sold so far. In 1952, Cadillac acquired limousine divisions of General Motors, which further cemented its status as a luxury brand and a symbol of prestige and wealth. In 1957, James M. Roche took over the design of Cadillac and came out with one of the most talked about designs, the 1957 Eldorado Brougham. Curiously, during the 1950s, Cadillac's advertising highlighted beautiful women and gowns. During the 1960s, Cadillac made some design changes. In 1963, they introduced front seatbelts, which soon became the industry standard, a common trend. In 1964, it introduced automatically controlled headlamps, as well as something called the Comfort Control, which was a heating, venting, and air conditioning system controlled through a thermostat. This was the first of its kind in the automobile industry. In the 1970s, Cadillac made engineering improvements. It introduced its newest model, the Eldorado, with 400 horsepower and an 8.2-liter engine. It had a completely redesigned axle with the highest torque capacity present in any car. During the 1980s, Cadillac worked on brewing some revolutionary changes that were then unveiled in the 1990s. The first of which was an electric traction control system, the first ever introduced on a four-wheel drive vehicle. This became the standard feature of all the 1990 Cadillac Alliance. That same year, it also won the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. In 1992, it introduced a new technology that allowed the car to run up to 50 miles without any coolant. But the Cadillac empire was showing signs of weakness. During the 1990s, more and more people began noticing a reduced quality in its manufacturing. This meant that fewer people were buying Cadillacs, and its market share dropped to just 22% in 1990. Just 10 years ago, its market share was at 31%. If you're wondering who benefited the most from this, it was of course Cadillac's competitor, Lincoln Motors, the company Henry Leland started once he resigned from Cadillac almost 70 years back. During the same decade, Lincoln Motors' market share doubled, and in 1998, Lincoln Motors outsold Cadillac. So Cadillac had to pivot to a new direction. It adopted an art and science philosophy in the 2000s, where it focused on sharp edges and increasingly sophisticated technology. This can be seen on the CT6 sedan and the XT5 crossover. But as much as Cadillac denied it, they had to face a bitter truth. Their quality was no longer worth spending money on. But it was also during this time that Cadillacs began looking more old school. It lost its badge as a symbol of status, and fierce competition by emerging European and Japanese markets threatened its place in the automobile industry. Although General Motors had been saved several times by federal bailout, it had been unable to put Cadillacs back at its place as a luxury car. Cadillac tried increasing its price by a high margin without anticipating a loss in sales. But the problem was Cadillac had lost its intangible quality that it once had in its early days. People weren't ready to pay just for the brand name, especially when the quality had gone down significantly. However, despite this, Cadillac's marketing strategy during this remained very aggressive in proving its worth as a luxury car company. In 2015, it signed a deal with a luxury hotel, Fairmont Hotels and Resorts, to host events and invite guests. Moreover, Cadillac in the 2010s doubled down on its promise on delivering designs so well they simply can't be copied. One such example was the 2017 Cadillac CTS V-Sport. It redesigned its front and rear fascia and even introduced new wheel designs. But despite its emphasis on marketing, in 2019 it was revealed that Cadillac fared far worse in its problems experienced per 100 vehicles measure compared to other companies. For context, the industry average is 136. In 2019, Cadillac was at 166. This means that Cadillac fell into a trap of high-priced, low-quality cars that people no longer feel proud of owning. Rather, one research states that people might even feel a certain degree of embarrassment over owning a Cadillac. For this reason, the rise and fall of Cadillac had been a subject of great interest, especially since the primary reasons for its failure once used to be the reasons why it was so successful at first. Cadillac's quality, especially under the Lelands, made the company successful. Its worsening quality in the 21st century became the reason for its downfall. In the same way, Cadillac once used to be a company considered light years ahead of its competitors. Now, it's barely able to keep up. So after more than a century of innovations, here we are. Once a glorious, formidable empire, now turned into a mediocre luxury car brand. Cadillac's story is one of intrigue, of curiosity. But in the end, it was also a story of how companies fall into the trap of thinking they no longer need high-quality products to keep making money, and how they have to learn the truth the painful way.